Today is Sunday, July 23rd, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Recently, in discussions on Facebook, which I enjoy, by the way, even though the discussions and some of the people that things are discussed with can be annoying, usually I try to take something helpful away from the discussions, and I'm usually able to do that. That's why I spend as much time engaged in those discussions as I do. I find them helpful. Usually because I get to hear arguments and encounter ideas that aren't my own, and it gives me something to think about. One of the issues that comes up again and again, in fact, it was mentioned in a homily at my parish today, is that some polls have been taken that say all kinds of negative stuff about Catholics in this generation. They say all kinds of negative things. They say that 70% of Catholics don't believe in the real presence. They say that this percentage of Catholics no longer go to Mass regularly. This percentage of Catholics don't believe in the divinity of Christ. This percentage of Catholics use contraception, and on and on. And these polls are used to beat up the Catholic Church, to beat up the Pope and bishops, to beat up pastors and priests, to beat up Catholic young adults. And they're also used to market and sell all kinds of unnecessary books and programs and conferences and everything else you can imagine in the big marketing machine. But I think that this use of polling is, first of all, unreasonable, and second of all, it really misses the mark as to what, at least I think, the problem is that we are experiencing in the Catholic Church. First of all, as for this unreasonable use of polls, there's an assumption that's made when these polls are quoted, and this assumption is not proven. This assumption is not to be granted. It assumes something that first needs to be proven, which cannot be proven. If I say that 70% of Catholics do not believe in the real presence, what does that actually mean? First of all, we don't know who these so-called Catholics are. Obviously, no one asked me. I would have caused the number to go up a little in terms of believing in the real presence. We don't know who these Catholics are. It's obviously a sample that's taken, and they're likely self-identifying Catholics. So you walk up to someone and ask, "Are you a Catholic?" They say yes, and we're all going to pretend that that means that someone actually represents the Catholic Church. Whereas we wouldn't allow anyone to do that anywhere. It's this idea of self-identification that we're arguing about currently with respect to gender and stuff like that. So if we walk down the street and say, "What gender are you?" and someone says, "I'm a male," even though it's obviously a biological woman, do we now start taking that information and polling into consideration when we talk about men? Of course not. This self-identification method of classifying people is ridiculous. And yet we allow this kind of nonsense with polling, not because we're actually seeking accurate information, but because we're looking for information in polls that we can use to promote our own arguments. And it's unreasonable. So first of all, we're talking about a sample size, and it's not reasonable to take the result of a sample and apply it to the whole class. That's called extrapolation. You can't do that with any logical certainty. So for example, if I were to go and ask 100 people, what do you like better, chocolate or vanilla ice cream? And out of the 100 people that I asked, 75 said chocolate. I can't use that information to now draw a universal conclusion and say that 75% of human beings prefer chocolate ice cream. Polling doesn't allow us to draw universal conclusions. What the poll does is it gives me a suggestion. I could obviously suggest something like, it appears that the majority of people prefer chocolate ice cream. That's all that polling allows me to do. It gives me an idea, it makes a suggestion of something that is possible, maybe even probable, but it doesn't reveal anything certain. And therefore, it makes no sense to take the results of a poll, extrapolate the results and apply them universally, and then pretend like that is proven fact that's absolutely certain and should be used as a cause for changing things or drawing conclusions about people and things. That's not reasonable. That's not what polls are really for. Polls are helpful as sources of relatively inexpensive and convenient suggestions or likelihoods. Any other use for them is unreasonable and inappropriate. And they're normally used selectively. So the same person on one day will complain about how useless polls are because the poll doesn't support his opinion. And he'll point out all of the flaws and all the problems with polls. And then the next day, the same guy will be quoting a poll because he found one that agrees with him, and he presents it as if the poll is a source of truth. Whereas he articulated all the problems with using polls in the way that he's now using a poll, because it agrees with him. And that's the kind of insincerity, inconsistency, and lack of reason that we find in the popular use of polls, because polls are lazy. Polls are lazy. They allow us to pretend we've got some kind of evidence or data, which really isn't what we pretend that it is. If polls were really accurate, we wouldn't need to have elections. We could just let 20 people vote and then just decide the election based on the results of that sample. No one would do that because we know that the sample doesn't necessarily represent what's true. Especially if you're a Democrat and it's after 11 p.m., right? We can find that the results completely flip. I'm just saying that in jest, but we allow everyone to vote until the end of the voting period because we know that samples are not necessarily true. So we can't use polls, we can't use data collected from samples as something more than what it is. So that's the first problem. This use of polls as if it's some sort of demonstrative evidence is not reasonable. There are 1.4 billion Catholics, so I'd like to know what the actual sample size was of the quote-unquote Catholics that were asked that question. And the further that sample size is from the total, the less and less reliable the results actually are. So it's really stupid to run to all kinds of conclusions and be preaching that the sky is falling because a poll has some bad news. And again, in the same person's mouth, we'll find polls being criticized on a different day. So we've got to be more consistent than this. That's the first problem. The second problem, as I said, with allowing people to self-identify, I mean, that's ridiculous. Now, the other problem with the use of the polls, as I mentioned before, is that there's an assumption when we hear these numbers. We say 70% or 69%, I think it was, of Catholics don't believe in the real presence. And immediately everyone throws their hands up in the air and they say, "See, I told you, it's just getting worse and worse." And everybody's walking around complaining that the church is falling apart, Catholics are abandoning the faith, all of this negative judgment as a result of this poll. But there's a glaring problem with these conclusions. If we're going to be reasonable, the problem is we don't have data from the past. This isn't a poll that's been conducted for the last 1,500 years. Just because the results appear bad in a poll doesn't allow us, or doesn't justify assuming that the number would have been better 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. I don't know if the Pew Research people would have been in medieval Italy polling the self-identifying Catholics and asking them about doctrines of the faith. I don't know what percentage of the Italian peasantry would be accurately answering those theological questions. So to pretend that because the numbers don't look good, it can be concluded that they are worse than they would have been in the past is simply not reasonable. We don't have prior results to these polls, and therefore to use the polls to say things are getting worse and here's proof is not reasonable, because it's not proving that things are getting worse, because we have no prior results to compare with. And the desire or the attempt to use the poll to do that is sophistical. This is the kind of stuff that Christians are not supposed to do. And yet we find Christians do this very thing. They make arguments that to ignorant people, to emotional people who are eager to criticize the church, these false arguments will appear to be reasonable. That's the danger of sophistry. They use what Aristotle called apparent syllogisms. They appear to be reasonable arguments. The ignorant fall for them, and it takes carefully thinking, trained logicians to actually point out the fallacies in the reasoning, that the conclusions don't actually follow from the premises. But this is common among Catholics today, this unreasonable, sophistical arguing. So the polls, or at least one of the polls, the one that talks about Catholics believing in the real presence, tells us that from a self-identifying sample, the size of which I don't actually know, from a self-identifying sample, a majority don't seem to believe in the Catholic doctrine of the real presence. Now, again, just to be fair, I really don't know that the doctrine of the real presence is a doctrine that many Catholics on the street are ready to dig into. It's easy to say, it's easy just to repeat the mantra, yes, I believe that Christ is really present in the Eucharist. But if the question is worded in a different sort of way and made more personal, or seems to suggest like we're going to open this up and get into more details, a lot of people will say, I don't know, or I'm not sure, or I really don't know what that means. Because it's a very complicated issue. Again, easy just to say you believe it, but difficult to actually explain or defend. And so the bottom line is this polling is being used to justify everything from new books from Bishop Barron to the attack on the Second Vatican Council. The Pew Research Group has found that 69% of these self-identifying Catholics whose identity we know nothing of have claimed that they don't believe in the real presence. Therefore, you need this book from Bishop Barron. You need to abandon the Novus Ordo Mass. You need to condemn Pope Francis as a heretic. It can be used to justify or appear to justify all kinds of wackiness. And this is what it's unfortunately being used to do. Just constant criticism, constant attack on the church, as if the church is doing stuff wrong. And this really leads to the issue that I'd like to talk about. Again, I hear all the time, the church is collapsing, the Catholic Church is dying, the church is hemorrhaging members. All of this negative doomsday, the sky is falling, everything is unraveling, Western civilization is falling apart. All of this negative doomsday talk. And again, the problem that I have as far as reasoning goes is that it seems like we're comparing, or I should say, it seems like we're drawing conclusions about trends or developments over time when there's no actual data from past times. We're just seeing an undesirable outcome and jumping to the conclusion that this is actually accelerating in a negative direction. And there's no justification for that conclusion. We don't know that the situation is worse. We may say that it's objectively undesirable or bad, but we can't say that it's worse for lots of complicated reasons. And I'll share a few that I've shared in discussions recently. There are currently 1.4 billion Catholics on earth. And I don't know if that's numbers drawn from official church records or if that's self-identifying. Let's take the worst scenario and say it's self-identifying. 1.4 billion Catholics in the world. Now, if we were to take this poll and extrapolate the results to the entire Catholic population and say only 30% believe in the real presence, that would be somewhere between 400 and 500 million people. Let's say 400 million Catholics. So it would be possible that 400 to 500 million Catholics believe in the real presence on earth. That's quite impressive. If we think about the numbers and say that in 2020, 400 to 500 million people identifying as Catholics believe in the real presence, despite all of the attacks on the faith, despite all of the secularism, despite all of the scientific criticism of Catholicism, despite all of that, despite scandals in the church, despite modern secular education, despite all of these challenges and obstacles, 400 to 500 million people on earth believe that Christ is really present in the Eucharist. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. And I want you to consider it in light of this. I looked up some church statistics, and you can search this out on your own if you think I'm wrong. I went back to 1910. I believe the year I looked was 1910. So there are 1.4 billion Catholics in the world today, and 400 to 500 million of them believe in the real presence. How many total Catholics do you think were in the world in 1910? How many Catholics were in the world in 1910, so 100 years ago? The number that I saw in church population statistics was 300 million. And again, these numbers, I'd appreciate it, in fact, if you checked it out on your own and tried to find some reliable data. I did the best that I could. And what I saw was the Catholic population back around 1910 was somewhere near 300 million. Now think about it. If we granted an unreasonable, unjustified assumption that said, well, back in the old days, back in the golden days, back before the Second Vatican Council, everybody believed in the real presence, which is obviously not justified, just an assumption. But if we were to grant that assumption, 300 million people on earth would have believed in the real presence, whereas today there are between 400 and 500 million people who might believe that. The situation today is better than it was 100 years ago, by quite a bit. 1 to 200 million more people believe in the real presence. So you can see that when you actually take these statistics that people run crazy with, and you compare them to historical data, the arguments that they prove that everything is unraveling and falling apart are not justified. It's not true. And if you were to say, yeah, but the world population is increasing at this and that rate, and therefore that rate is actually not very good. Where do we ever learn, where are we ever told that there's some kind of rate at which the Catholic population is supposed to increase over time? There's no talk of that anywhere in church history and scripture or tradition, that the population of the Catholic Church must always increase at a rate of whatever percent, or that's proof that the church is struggling and there's no doctrine that says the rate or the percentage of the world population is supposed to be at a certain number, or else that's proof that the Pope is a heretic and the church is lost at sea. There's just no such teaching. And so these assumptions, these doomsday criticisms of the church, they just have no justification. No justification. Now, when we actually look and see how the church hierarchy, the Pope and bishops, how they react to things in the world, we see that they acknowledge that there are great troubles, great problems, great obstacles for the faith. The hierarchy of the church acknowledges that. The difference is that they actually do things to address those issues, and their diagnosis of the problem and the remedies that they propose for the problems differ from those of other people. So we'll find some people who will say, look at this, people are losing the faith, kids are leaving the Catholic Church, therefore we must do this. And people talk about things that they have no authority whatsoever to be talking about. It's not their role. They have no office for such. They have no access to information and resources that the Pope and bishops have access to. And it's just this ignorant peasant rattling in the street. They have no idea what the causes of these problems are. They have no idea what the remedies may be. The Pope and bishops have access to much more resources, much more information, experts and leaders all over the world to consult, to learn what's actually going on. And when we find the Pope and bishops publishing their diagnoses of the problems, along with their remedies for the problems, we should trust in their judgment as the actual, key word, actual leaders of the church who are actually responsible to diagnose these problems and publish the remedies. Our role in the Catholic Church is to listen to our leaders and to obey, to trust in their judgment, and even more importantly, to trust in God's providence in their judgment. These things are mysterious. This isn't some kind of lemonade stand business plan. When we talk about church government, the papacy, the magisterium, all of these things, we're talking about mysteries that are really God's business, not our business. God has established the order. We see the order that God has established, but beyond that order, we don't know anything. And it leads us to a principle that we read in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy, that says, "Those things which are revealed are for us, but the secret things belong to the Lord. That's a biblical principle of how God's people live in the relationship with God. God alone has all the information. He's omniscient. God, in that omniscience, has established a system through which he works in the world. We have a particular place in that system by his providence, and we've got to learn to trust in the reality of that. We've got to learn to look in the mirror and say, dude, you're not the Pope. Father Joe Smith of Goobersville, Indiana, you probably don't have a handle on all the details of global Catholicism. You probably aren't the physician that the world needs to prescribe the remedies for problems that are not only present in Goobersville, but also in Central Africa and India and Vietnam and Europe and Canada and all through the world. You have no idea what you're talking about because it's none of your business. And that's true for all priests, and that's true for all laymen. These questions of Catholicism on a global scale are none of our business. We don't have the information we need to make good decisions. We don't have the resources needed. We don't have the calling. We don't have any sign that it's God's will for us to be meddling in those issues. God knows where we are. If God felt that Pastor Joe, where was he from? Goobersville? Whatever city name I made up. If God decides that Pastor Joe in Goobersville is the smartest man on the planet and has all the answers for global Catholic problems, God can come down to Goobersville and pull Father Joe out and bring him to Rome. But Father Joe is in Goobersville by God's providence. And nobody's asking him for his diagnosis. Just because he signed up for a free blog account and got himself a Twitter account doesn't mean that he's now an archbishop consulting with popes and kings. It's just this wackiness where these modern resources, this access to this popular information on the internet, leads people to go nuts and think that because their last post got 70 views, that they have some kind of global influence. They're just nuts. We have to trust in God's providence, trust in the hierarchy of the church, because beyond what is visible to us, beyond what's revealed to us in terms of church doctrine, how the church is actually organized, beyond that, it's all mystery to us. God only knows what the truth is. And God works through the hierarchical church that he established. And William Michael, walking along the road in Monroe, North Carolina, is not responsible to decide what the Pope should do or to judge what the Pope decides to do after he makes his decisions. It's none of our business. We're not called to meddle with these decisions, nor will we be held accountable for these decisions. We're free to mind our own business, and that's what we should do. And what is our business should be the question that we're actually asking. And this is where I really have a different perspective than most of the Catholics that I know. I'm a convert or a revert to Catholicism. I was baptized as a baby in the Catholic Church. I was sent to CCD classes as an elementary school kid. I was a public school student, sent to CCD classes, made First Communion, First Confession. Never made confirmation because our family was not going to church by that time, and I was just a public school, worldly kid. There were no Catholics knocking on my door, asking if I was okay. There were no pastoral visits to our house from the Catholic Church, checking to see why we weren't at Mass, seeing if there were any problems they could help us with. When we stopped going to church, there was no contact, ever, from the church, from any Catholics. I only knew one Catholic, two actually. One was down the road from me. I knew that one of my friends on our street, his father was supposedly a deacon in the Catholic Church, and I had no idea what that even meant. They were not the best family anyway, so it was kind of strange because the mother in that family was famous on the block for having a loud, filthy mouth that the whole street talked about. That was the Catholic family on our street. And there was one other woman who was my third grade CCD teacher who happened to be the mother of one of my baseball teammates. I knew she was a Catholic. But that was it. There was no outreach from the Catholic Church that I was baptized into or that I received First Communion in. There was never any contact. I was just lost in the world as a kid. And then when I was a senior in high school, I met a girl, as I always tell the story about how I met my wife. She was a girl who came to my high school. Her family, they were evangelical Christians. And when Dania and I started to talk and hang out, I used to hang out with her family a lot, they invited me to go to church. An evangelical family was the only people that ever reached out to me as a lost soul and offered to help. And all they did was ask if I wanted to join them in going to their church on Sunday, and I said yes, I did want to go. And from that point, my own personal journey, reading scriptures, finding answers to questions, took place almost in isolation. A couple of Protestant friends along the way, a couple of Protestant pastors who sort of kicked me in the right direction at different points as I slowly made my way back to the Catholic faith. No interaction from Catholics at all until I finally decided. Actually, I want to take that back. There was one Catholic influence. And I've told this story before. There was one Catholic influence. One time I was staying at a friend's house who was the owner of a prominent Protestant publishing company. And while I was staying at his house, late at night I was flipping through the channels and I came across Mother Angelica on EWTN. And I remember watching her for a few minutes and saying to my wife, wow, this old nun is, something about her is pretty interesting. And that was it. But in my personal life, in my actual experience, I can't even remember seeing a Catholic priest. From the time I was 10 years old at CCD until I returned to the Catholic Church when I was 30 years old. I don't remember seeing a Catholic priest anywhere in my life. I don't remember meeting any Catholics. I don't remember any Catholic ever talking to me, ever giving me any information, inviting me to church. And I was in central New Jersey, where there are plenty of Catholic churches, schools, and so on. And so when I returned to the church, I was looking up information on where I could go to church, and I just showed up one Sunday at a mass at the scheduled time with a very vague memory of what even happens at mass, and I chose to return to the Catholic Church. Again, with really no influence from any Catholic in my life. And I can tell you that the day that my wife and I, we were 30 years old, it was 2005, when we decided just to show up with 3 kids, 5 and under. We just showed up at a Catholic Mass one Sunday in Pennsylvania, sat in the back pew, had no idea what to expect, had no idea what was going on. And there were 2 things that we noted. We noted that the place was beautiful. It was an old Catholic church. I remember the kids loved the paintings on the ceiling. I remember that. But the thing that stood out to us even more was that when we went there, the Catholic people who were sitting around us were very friendly. And we felt welcome. They were happy to see us. They were very friendly, introduced themselves, greeted us, asked us where we're from, what we're doing, if we'd been here before. We were very greatly comforted by the friendliness of the Catholic people that we ran into that day. They made us feel welcome, took the edge off that visit. I think I remember them pointing out a few things along the way, where we were in a hymnal or a missal or something like that, but just took the edge off the discomfort of that visit. And that was it. We then decided to return to the church, and again, it was me calling the parish. We moved to North Carolina. We called the parish. We still weren't set. We still weren't sure if we were going to convert. We were Anglicans. We still weren't sure if we wanted to convert. I remember coming down to Monroe, North Carolina, talking with the Anglican rector, who happened to be a retired classics professor, so I had a buddy when we came down to North Carolina, talking about what was keeping me back from becoming a Catholic, and he was telling me the same thing about his own experience. But we decided to become Catholics. We called the parish office and said we want to become Catholics. I remember walking into the church office, meeting the parish priest. I had no idea what I was doing. I just remember saying to the priest, I want to become a Catholic, and I just want you to teach me what I need to do, because I want to be a Catholic. And he asked me about why I was interested in being a Catholic, and I explained how my studies had led me to a number of views that seemed to continually be bringing me closer and closer to Catholicism, that Catholicism was really the only system that I saw that was teaching the things that I believed to be true, especially as Anglicanism was just sort of running off the rails towards homosexuality and all that stuff. And we were received into the church. We were received into a parish that was chaotic, disorganized, terrible music, all kinds of craziness, no discipline. And at that point in our life, it was perfect for us. It was hardly Catholic. It was, I would say, very Protestant-y feeling. You know, it's southern North Carolina Catholic parish. It was very comfortable for Protestants coming into the Catholic Church. There were a few things for us to swallow as we got started. We got to go through the RCIA class, which was very, very simple, bare bones kind of stuff. And that was good for us because we needed to come in easily. And that was a good experience. I got my first Catholic Bible from the RCIA teacher, which had commentary on the pages, which allowed me to start studying the Bible as a Catholic. Very simple stuff. We got a copy of the Catechism, which I thought was miraculous. And I started studying the Catechism. And we just started going to Mass and learning things little by little, stumbling along as we went. And over time, we got our act together and started to get the hang of things and got a little more serious about becoming Catholics and seeking more formation and getting into more challenging resources. But it took time. It took time for us to do that. And there was never any pressure or criticism. There was just always friendliness and support, positive support for us as we came in. The motivation to become more perfect didn't come from the people around us. It came from within us. We wanted to be Catholic. We wanted to be more perfect. We wanted to become holy. We wanted to be more disciplined. That was coming from within us. No one needed to drag us and kick us, but we needed to grow little by little. And in God's providence, the church provided us exactly what we need. We were able to grow, not only becoming Catholics ourselves, but figuring out what to do with our children, figuring out things like faith formation and sacramental preparation, learning things like the Liturgy of the Hours and how to actually live a Catholic life. And we were left to learn those things little by little with nothing but support from our wacky parish. There are lots of friendly people, opportunities to learn little by little, and really no pressure, no criticism, no nagging. And again, the motivation to grow and become better was in us. No one needed to force us to do anything. It just was a matter of time for us to grow. All of the principle of life was present already, just like the principle of life is present in the seed of a plant. But the plant grows at a certain natural rate, and there's nothing you can do to force it faster. The same was true of us, and the church perfectly nurtured that growth in us, and again, did so with no pressure. And we were the only Catholics that we knew. I remember when we had our first Catholic children baptized, they asked us if we were going to name any godparents. We didn't even know any Catholic people. We couldn't even name godparents. We didn't know any Catholics. And so stuff like that was a stumbling block for us. You know, godparents, friends of ours who are going to help us raise our Catholic kids, we're the only Catholics we know anywhere. And so the first godparents for our older children were just a couple that we met at RCIA who were teachers in RCIA, they were the godparents for our first baptized Catholic kids. And so I think for Catholics who grow up Catholic, they take a lot of things for granted, not realizing that converts coming in, people coming from the world, people coming from Protestant backgrounds, these things can't be taken for granted. And the church allows all kinds of wiggle room in these things, not because the church is unfaithful, not because the church hates tradition, but because this isn't Catholic Europe. This is more like pagan Europe. And there are all kinds of problems and issues people have. People are coming into the church already divorced, married, but not really married. We were married in a Baptist church. We had to go through preparation for Catholic matrimony. Kids who are already baptized, who have already been to Protestant churches, now coming into Catholic churches, all kinds of things different for them, all kinds of family problems. I had to give up my job because of my conversion to Catholicism. So I went through changing jobs, relocating, starting a whole new life, again, having no Catholic friends or relatives. And I don't think that the situations that people actually live in are thought of by Catholics who spend all their time criticizing the church. The church is ministering to people like me, people like my wife, a converting evangelical that doesn't know anything about Catholicism. And the church ministered to us very effectively in a parish that I am sure many Catholics would criticize to death if they showed up on a Sunday morning. But there's so much that goes on outside of that Sunday Mass, behind the scenes, all through the week, in our home, in the church office. And these things aren't discussed. And they need to be discussed because the criticism of the church is not fair. Now, 18 years later, which is today, my wife and I are lay Dominicans. My wife and I chose recently to move to a different parish because our kids are older now. Our youngest is 8. We've got adult children. And the parish that we belong to for the last 18 years, just because of the demographics of our county, has become heavily Hispanic, and they've had to focus their ministry on Hispanic families. So we're sort of oddballs at that parish, and we chose to move south a bit to a parish across the South Carolina border where there's much stricter culture, much more challenging teaching. But that was voluntary. Again, the motive for that was in us. We weren't forced to do that. Nobody yelled at us and made us do that. We wanted to move to a place that was more appropriate for our family in our current condition. And we're sort of working now through the challenges of moving into a parish that's got much higher standards for Catholic culture, takes much more for granted. That's new to us, that we're just learning about. And I can feel some situations where if we would have come to this parish in 2005, or if someone came to this parish in the condition that we were in 2005, they wouldn't stay for 2 weeks because it's just not suited. It's not suited to a family or to people that were in the state we were in when we chose to enter the church. Now, as far as the church declining and all of this talk about the church falling apart, I think that there is another phenomenon that's causing this apparent decline of the church. And I emphasize the word apparent because I don't think it's real, at least in God's sight. The Second Vatican Council was called by Pope John the 23rd to address sweeping changes that were taking place outside the church. The church was the same, but circumstances outside the church were not the same. The church just went through 2 world wars, where a huge percentage of the population of Europe was killed. New systems of government, new economic philosophies were in place. The whole society was changing. And the church, in God's providence, saw the signs of the times, called a council, and made significant changes in the life of the church. Now, it's important to note that the leaders of the church called that council and made those changes because of problems that existed outside the church. The sources of the problems were external, and they were already in motion. The sources of the trouble were outside the church, and they were already in motion, and the church was responding to these great problems. And the church made changes. And we know that those changes went into effect around 1970, and Christianity appears to have declined since that time. And what people do today, which is irrational, is they say, look, Christianity is declining. Catholic population is declining, even though it's not, but they'll argue that relative to I talked about that before. But they'll say Christianity is declining. People are leaving the church in increasing numbers. And again, these statistics need to be proven, not just accepted. And they point back and say, you know what? If we look at the data, it shows us that these negative developments happened after the Second Vatican Council. Therefore, logically, because this comes after that, that must be the cause. And of course, that's a fallacy. That's called the post hoc fallacy in reasoning. No reasonable person would ever fall for something that ridiculous. And again, it ignores the whole context of the Second Vatican Council, which was the fact that the church discerned problems outside the church that were already in effect. And the church in the Second Vatican Council was responding pastorally to those changes. The circumstances were changing. The effects of those changes were inevitable as far as the church was concerned, and the church had to figure out how to respond to those changes. And that's what led to the changes of the Second Vatican Council. So pointing to a decline in Christianity and ignoring all of those factors outside the church Just think of the advent of the internet. Free access to pornography anywhere you go. That was a problem that my generation did not need to face. Kids today grow up with that challenge. I didn't grow up with that challenge. My parents didn't grow up with that challenge. To pretend that that's not going to have some negative effect on younger generations is just foolish. The distractions of what are very powerful tools that our generation is just learning how to control. Changes in society, changes in the economy, changes in travel, changes in communication, all kinds of social and political changes, the civil rights movement, women voting, women in the workplace, contraception, abortion being legalized, the rise of daycare centers and public schools where kids are dropped off when they're just a few weeks old. These are all radical, historically unprecedented changes happening outside the church that have all kinds of negative influences on the spiritual life of men, women, and children. The church is not the cause of these problems. In fact, the Catholic Church, is one of the only sources of resistance to these changes, if we're honest and fair. The Catholic Church is one of the only forces resisting these changes. The rise of democracy, socialism, all of these external forces, the promotion of philosophies like evolution that spreads through every college, university, and school, undermines faith in creation. These are not things that the church invented or that the Second Vatican Council brought into the world. These are unprecedented attacks on Catholic Christianity that the church is working to resist and absorb. And the church, since the Second Vatican Council, I would argue, has weathered the storm. And the negative results are the casualties of these attacks that the church has faced, that Christian people and human beings in general have faced. To point to the Second Vatican Council and say that was the cause of all of this trouble is just stupid. I mean, really, it's stupid to suggest that. It was a modern pope who took the stand against contraception. That's the modern Catholic Church. That's a radical position in modern society that's brought so much criticism upon the church, and the church has stood strong on that position. The church has led resistance against the legalization of abortion. When we look at things like homosexuality, gay marriage, transgender issues, the church is compassionate and yet at the same time has remained strong. And if you don't think the church has remained strong, look at other branches of Christianity. Look at the Anglican Church. It's lost. It's gone. Look at other branches. Look at the Lutheran Church. And when you look at these other Christian groups and see how they've been almost completely overtaken by these modern movements, you'll see that the Catholic Church alone has stood strong against all of these attacks. And you're going to criticize the church because she's taking losses? It's like criticizing injured and killed soldiers in a war, and arguing that because there are casualties, they're all a bunch of cowards, when the reason why there are casualties is because the enemies are very great and they're fighting to resist them as valiantly as they can. The criticism is unjust and unreasonable. And as I said, my own conversion and entrance and development in the church in this present age where all hell is supposedly breaking loose and the sky is falling is proof that the church is faithfully ministering to people who are coming in. And if Christians, like the leadership of the church, would be more discerning of the signs of the times and understanding of the battle that people are facing in this modern society, and would take on a more evangelistic mentality rather than a critical mentality. Like you're trying to enjoy the finest things in Catholic culture while the streets are on fire. And that's not just. It's not reasonable. It's like a family that lives in wealth during a time of peace. Beautiful family culture, beautiful meals throughout the day, beautiful clothing, beautiful gardens, manicured lawns. And all of a sudden war breaks out and the family starts complaining that all of their delicacies are being disturbed by this inconvenient war outside. When the circumstances change, the standards and the tastes have to change to serve the needs of the times. Like Solomon says, there's a time for everything. There's a time to seek out the highest and finest things in Catholic culture. There's a time to be content with food and clothing. St. Paul brags in the New Testament about how he was able to do both. A good example is in the life of St. Dominic. St. Dominic was a student, a university student, when there were all kinds of troubles, disease outbreaks and things in the community. And he had an incredibly valuable collection of books that he had studied with and actually made notes in throughout his studies. And when he saw the suffering of the people around him, he sold all of those books as a student, sold all of his books and gave the money to help those in need. We have to, as Catholics, we've got to realize that we're living in a time where it's really not appropriate to be looking for the finest things in Catholic culture. We're watching young people leave the church and just get criticized as they go, as if the adults in the parish are happy to not be disturbed by their sloppy clothes anymore. As if the church would rather those kids leave than embarrass them by their appearance. The Catholics don't have a mentality of a militant church engaged in life or death struggles. They're acting as if they live during peacetime, as if the victory has already been won, as if all the battles have already been fought and everyone is safe, when in fact, the battles are ramping up all around us, getting worse. The attacks are getting even worse. And the Catholics are fussing because we can't have fine clothing on display when we gather on Sundays. We can't have the finest music, or our church building doesn't look like church buildings looked like in the 15th century in Europe. So we're complaining about the music, complaining about education not being what it was in the 1700s. And we're complaining as we just ignore the battles that are being lost. And as the church is calling us to stop worrying about these peacetime privileges, but rather get to work with the present battles around us, the leaders of the church making these recommendations, giving these orders to the faithful, are being scoffed at and criticized. And yet the people who are complaining and criticizing the church are turning around and quoting polls that say that the church is hemorrhaging believers, and they're high-fiving as if these results are proving them to be right, rather than condemning them for their lack of action. Catholics need to realize what's going on, that we've returned largely to an apostolic church. We've returned, like I said, we're not a church that's ministering in Catholic Europe. We're the church living in the 1st century in the Roman Empire. We're all back to square one. This idea of new evangelization, it's like starting all over again, going back to basics. And what's significant, if we look in Acts chapter 3, St. Peter says this, which I think is very helpful today. St. Peter, who represents the church as its head, says in Acts chapter 3, to a poor man, a crippled man outside the temple, he says, "Silver and gold I do not have, but what I have I give you." In the time of the apostles, the church didn't have worldly things to offer people. It had no silver or gold. It had no buildings. It had no universities. It had no arts, no famous choirs or orchestras. St. Peter had no silver or gold. All that he had were the spiritual blessings given to the church by Christ, the gospel and the sacraments. That was all that Peter had. And I think we need to realize that that's where the church is at today. Obviously not to that extreme, but to a degree. The church is in a place today where it doesn't have silver and gold to offer the world. But what it has, it's working to give. And we're scoffing at those things. We're scoffing at the spiritual blessings. Just think about it. Catholic people are scoffing at the Eucharist in a parish that isn't decorated the way that they would like it, that isn't celebrating the liturgy in the way that they prefer. They're scoffing at the sacrament of the Eucharist, in which Christ makes himself present. Scoffing, despising the spiritual blessings the church has to offer, and mocking Peter because he has no silver and gold. That's what I think is happening in the church. I think that the Pope, who in God's providence took the name Francis upon himself for good reason, is calling the church back to a simple, primitive, apostolic Catholicism with a focus on evangelization, calling us to not take Catholic culture for granted because of the strength of the attacks against the church. Not that the church will ever or can ever fall, but it can be brought very low, and many members of the church can certainly fall. And the Pope and the bishops are calling us to focus on the basic things: the works of mercy, evangelization. And they're telling us to chill out with talk about rigidity, which is a term that Pope Francis uses. Chill out with rigidity because it's just not the right time. And there are so many people struggling with the basics that many of the things that Catholics are yelling about and fighting for are just not appropriate at the present time. Like people complaining and yelling that they want their normal dinners while people are trying to care for wounded soldiers in a hospital. It's just not the right time because things are really rough. And I think because the church is losing this material wealth and all of these secular temporal benefits that attract many to the church, many are choosing to leave because there's nothing attractive. They're not attracted to the spiritual blessings. They're not attracted to the gospel. They're looking for material benefits. They're looking for secular benefits. They're looking for social advancement, which in church history was available in the Catholic Church. And they're not finding those secular, temporal, material benefits. So they're saying, I'm out of here. And this is true of many kids, many young adults. Just don't see the church helping them in their temporal circumstances and choosing not to be a part of it anymore. And what we need to do is we need to evangelize, we need to preach the gospel, we need to explain to people the need for the spiritual benefits of the church, to attract them to the church for the right reasons. And we'll see that as far as pure worshipers are concerned, the church is not declining. The church is losing a lot of these fringe members interested in fringe benefits. And that's really not such a big deal, even though that it should be our desire to evangelize them and lead them to higher things. So anyway, I know that that's been a long talk. I want to cut this off. But I hope that that's helpful. Just a response to a lot of this negative, annoying criticism of the church that is not reasonable, not just, and is just inappropriate in light of the signs of the times, which the church has been warning us about since before the Second Vatican Council. I hope that's helpful. God bless.